There is a moment in every human life when the world you thought you knew dissolves, not gradually, not gently, but with the sudden, terrifying force of an earthquake beneath the architecture of your identity. The ground splits open, the walls crumble, and you, the person you believed yourself to be, falls through the cracks into something deeper, darker, and infinitely more vast than anything you've encountered before. This is not metaphor. This is not poetry. This is the dark night of the soul. Imagine yourself standing in a room you've known your entire existence. The furniture is familiar. The light falls through the windows in patterns you could predict with your eyes closed. You know which floorboards creak. You know where the shadows gather at dusk. This room is your identity, the carefully constructed self you present to the world, and perhaps more dangerously, to yourself. Now imagine that room beginning to decay from within. The walls that once protected you become a prison. The familiar objects that once brought comfort now seem like artifacts from someone else's life. The light that once illuminated now reveals only the terrible architecture of your own self-deception. And worst of all, you realize with creeping horror that you cannot leave, because you cannot distinguish where the room ends and you begin. You are the room, and the room is collapsing. What I'm describing is not some rare mystical experience reserved for saints and sages in distant caves. It is not the exclusive territory of the mentally ill or the spiritually advanced. It is, instead, one of the most profound and universal human experiences, the psychological breakdown that precedes every genuine transformation, the death that comes before rebirth, the dissolution that makes space for something unprecedented to emerge. The ancients knew this. They encoded it in their myths, Persephone descending into the underworld, Christ in the tomb before resurrection, the phoenix immolating itself in flame. But we, in our modern brilliance, have forgotten what they knew. We've pathologized the very process that makes us fully human. We call it depression, anxiety, a nervous breakdown, a mental health crisis. And while these clinical terms have their place, they miss something essential, something that the mystics, philosophers, and depth psychologists understood with crystalline clarity. Sometimes the psyche must shatter completely before it can reorganize itself at a higher level of complexity. Sometimes you must lose yourself entirely to find what was real all along. Tonight, we descend together into this darkness, not as medical professionals diagnosing pathology, not as spiritual seekers chasing enlightenment, but as explorers of consciousness itself, willing to look unflinchingly at the most terrifying and transformative experience the human psyche can undergo, the complete dismantling of the ego, the death of the self-concept, the annihilation of everything you thought made you, you. This journey will take us through neuroscience and nightmare, through philosophy and fracture, through the cutting edge of consciousness research and the timeless wisdom of those who've walked this path before us. We'll explore what happens in your brain when your sense of self begins to dissolve. We'll examine why this experience, though agonizing, might be evolution's most sophisticated tool for psychological growth. We'll investigate whether the boundaries between sanity and madness, illness and awakening, are as clear as we've been taught to believe. And we'll ask the most unsettling question of all. What if the thing you call you was never real to begin with? What if everything you're losing was always just a story, a convenient fiction, a house of cards waiting for the inevitable wind? But I must warn you, this is not a comfortable conversation. This is not self-help dressed in spiritual language. This is not a quick fix or a life hack or a shortcut to happiness. What we're exploring tonight is the most profound crisis of meaning and identity that a human being can face. And if you're here, listening to these words, there's a chance you're either in the midst of this darkness yourself, or you sense its approach on the horizon of your consciousness. If so, know this: you are not broken. You are not crazy. You are not failing at life. You are perhaps succeeding at something far more important: the courage to let what is false within you die, so that what is true can finally breathe. The dark night of the soul is not a destination. It is a passage, a threshold, a sacred and terrible doorway through which you must pass alone, stripped of all the costumes and masks and carefully curated performances that once defined you. On the other side, if you can endure the crossing, waits not the person you were trying to become, but the person you always were beneath the layers of conditioning, trauma, and social programming. So let us begin this descent. Let us journey together into the deepest darkness of human consciousness, not because we seek suffering, but because we understand that some truths can only be found in the places we're most afraid to look. Some wisdom can only be earned through the complete annihilation of everything we think we know. Welcome to the dark night of the soul. Welcome to the psychology of sacred breakdown. Welcome to the death that gives birth to consciousness itself. The question is not whether you will face this darkness in your lifetime. The question is whether you will recognize it for what it truly is when it comes for you, a catastrophe or an invitation. Mapping the territory of dissolution. To understand the dark night of the soul, we must first travel back through time, through the accumulated wisdom of those who've charted this territory before us. Because this experience, this psychological and spiritual crisis, is not a modern invention. It's woven into the very fabric of human consciousness, appearing again and again across cultures, centuries, and cosmologies with such consistency that we must conclude, this is not aberration. This is architecture. This is something fundamental to the structure of human development itself. The term dark night of the soul comes to us from a 16th century Spanish mystic, a Carmelite monk named John of the Cross. Imprisoned by his own religious order for advocating reform, locked in a tiny cell barely larger than a coffin, with almost no light and minimal food, John experienced something that would have destroyed most men. Instead, it transformed him. In that literal darkness, he encountered a deeper darkness, a spiritual and psychological dissolution so complete, so devastating, that he could only describe it through poetry. In a dark night, he wrote, with anxious love inflamed, O happy chance, I went forth unobserved, my house being now at rest. Notice the paradox embedded in his words. A dark night, yet a happy chance, anxious love, the house, his ego, his constructed self, finally at rest through complete dissolution. John understood something profound. The breakdown was not the enemy of awakening. It was the prerequisite. The ground had to be burned completely before new growth could emerge. But John was not the first to map this territory, not by millennia. Travel back further, to ancient India, to the forest texts called the Upanishads, written between 800 and 400 BCE. Here we find the concept of neti-neti, not this, not that. A methodical stripping away of every identification, every concept of self, until what remains is the unnameable awareness beneath all forms. The sages who composed these texts understood that enlightenment required a kind of systematic ego death, a deliberate dismantling of every false self until only the witnessing consciousness remained. This wasn't psychological theory. This was practice. This was technology. They knew that the self you think you are is constructed layer by layer, first the body, then the mind, then your roles and relationships, then your beliefs and values, then even your subtlest spiritual identifications. And they knew that liberation required the courage to let each layer burn away in the fire of sustained awareness until nothing remained but the fire itself. In ancient Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries, those secret rituals held in honor of Demeter and Persephone, promised initiates a transformation through symbolic death and rebirth. Participants would drink the kykeon, a sacred brew that likely contained psychoactive compounds, and descend into underground chambers where they would confront their own dissolution. Those who emerged spoke in hushed tones of an experience that changed them forever, that stripped away their fear of death by showing them something essential about the nature of consciousness itself. The philosopher Plato, himself likely an initiate, would later write, "Those who were truly touched by philosophy are practicing nothing other than dying and being dead." He understood that genuine transformation wasn't about accumulating knowledge. It was about the systematic death of ignorance, of delusion, of the false self's grip on identity. Fast forward to the 19th century, to the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, writing in the shadow of his own psychological crisis. Kierkegaard gave us the concept of the sickness unto death, not physical death, but something worse. Despair over one's own existence, the terrible awareness that the self you've constructed is fundamentally inauthentic, a performance rather than a genuine expression of being. He described it with characteristic intensity. The greatest hazard of all, losing one's self, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all. No other loss can occur so quietly. Any other loss, an arm, a leg, $5, a wife, etc., is sure to be noticed. Kierkegaard understood that most human suffering comes not from external circumstances, but from the exhausting labor of maintaining a false self. And he understood that the crisis of losing that false self, though agonizing, was actually the doorway to authentic existence. He called it the leap of faith, not faith in God necessarily, but faith in the groundless ground of being itself, the courage to exist without the security of a fixed, known identity. Then came Friedrich Nietzsche, that mad prophet of transformation, who gave us perhaps the most powerful metaphor for psychological death and rebirth, the three metamorphoses. The spirit, he said, must transform from camel to lion to child. The camel kneels to carry the heavy load of culture, tradition, and duty, all the shoulds and musts that society places upon us. This is the conventional self, obedient and burdened. But eventually, the camel must become a lion, fierce, destructive, willing to say, "I will," even in the face of the "thou shalt" of tradition. The lion destroys the old values, tears down the comfortable structures, kills the gods that have become too small. This is the dark night, the rebellion, the destruction, the necessary violence against the very foundations of one's previous existence. But even the lion is not the final form. The lion must die to become the child, innocent, playful, capable of genuine creativity, because it's no longer bound by either submission or rebellion. The child creates new values not from destruction, but from spontaneous joy in existence itself. Nietzsche knew this transformation intimately. He lived it. His own breakdown, which the world called madness, was perhaps the lion consuming itself, unable to complete the metamorphosis to the child. He whispered his truth to the world. "What does not kill me makes me stronger." But what he couldn't say was the corollary. Sometimes what makes you stronger first kills everything you thought you were. And then, at the turn of the 20th century, came Carl Gustav Jung, the man who would take these ancient and philosophical insights and forge them into a comprehensive psychology of transformation. Jung didn't just theorize about the dark night of the soul, he lived it. After his break with Freud in 1913, Jung entered what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. For years he descended into a voluntary madness, opening himself to visions, voices, and archetypal forces that rose from the depths of his psyche. He drew mandalas, conversed with inner figures, recorded his visions in what would become the Red Book. That massive illuminated manuscript he kept hidden for decades because he feared the world would think him insane. During this period, Jung wrote, "I stood helpless before an alien world. Everything in it seemed difficult and incomprehensible. I was living in a constant state of tension. Often I felt as if gigantic blocks of stone were tumbling down upon me. One thunderstorm followed another." But Jung didn't just survive this breakdown. He transformed it into a map for others. He gave us the concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are beneath all the masks and personas. And he understood that this process required descent before ascent. It required facing what he called the shadow, all the rejected, repressed, and disowned aspects of yourself that lurk beneath consciousness, growing stronger in the darkness. Jung knew that psychological breakdown often occurs when the shadow can no longer be ignored, when the repressed material gains enough energy to shatter the ego's defenses. The carefully constructed personality cracks, the unconscious floods in, and suddenly you're drowning in material you spent your whole life trying to keep at bay: rage, grief, shame, desire, terror, and something else, something deeper. The terrible recognition that everything you thought was solid about yourself is actually fluid, that everything you thought was you is actually just a temporary crystallization of consciousness in form. This is why Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness must become conscious, not transcended, not bypassed, not spiritually bypassed with positive thinking and affirmations. Made conscious, integrated, transformed through awareness itself." Jung gave us another crucial concept: the ego death that precedes the birth of the self, capital S. The ego is the center of consciousness, but it is not the totality of who you are. Beneath and beyond the ego lies the self, the organizing principle of the entire psyche, the archetype of wholeness, the goal toward which individuation moves. But the ego cannot surrender its control willingly. It must be broken. It must die 1,000 deaths before it finally relaxes its grip and allows the self to emerge. This is the dark night, the ego fighting desperately for survival even as it's being dissolved by forces far greater than itself. The pain is not the pain of something going wrong. It's the pain of something finally going right. Now let us bring this journey into the present, into the realm of neuroscience and contemporary psychology, because the ancient wisdom is being validated by modern science in ways that should send shivers down your spine. In the 1960s and 70s, researchers like Stanislav Grof worked with thousands of people undergoing psychedelic therapy, particularly with LSD. What Grof discovered was striking. Many patients experienced what he called ego death, a complete dissolution of their sense of separate self, often accompanied by visions of their own death, feelings of cosmic unity, and profound mystical experiences. And those who were able to surrender to this ego death rather than fight it emerged transformed, with reduced anxiety, depression, and fear of death itself. Grof mapped what he called spiritual emergencies, crises that look like psychotic breaks, but are actually the psyche's attempt to reorganize itself at a higher level of integration. He noticed that these crises followed patterns remarkably similar to the initiatory ordeals described in shamanic traditions and mystical texts: birth trauma, ego death, cosmic unity. These weren't just metaphors. They were actual experiences accessible through non-ordinary states of consciousness. Modern neuroscience has begun to illuminate what's happening in the brain during these experiences. Recent research using brain imaging during psychedelic experiences shows something remarkable: a decrease in activity in the default mode network, the brain's sense of self network, the neural correlate of the ego. The default mode network includes regions like the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, areas associated with self-referential thinking, autobiographical memory, and mental time travel. This is the network that maintains your sense of being a separate, continuous self moving through time. It's what's active when you're lost in thoughts about yourself, your past, your future, your problems, your plans, and during ego-death experiences, whether induced by psychedelics, meditation, near-death experiences, or spontaneous psychological breakdown, this network quiets, sometimes dramatically. The boundaries that usually separate self from other, observer from observed, begin to dissolve. You don't just intellectually understand that separation is an illusion, you experience it. The constructed self simply stops being constructed. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris, a leading researcher in psychedelic neuroscience, has proposed the entropic brain hypothesis, The idea that consciousness exists on a spectrum from rigid order to fluid chaos, and that both extremes are pathological. Depression and anxiety involve an overconstrained brain locked into negative thought patterns and rigid self-concepts. Psychosis involves an underconstrained brain flooded with too much information and unable to maintain coherent patterns. But there's a sweet spot, a state of optimal entropy where the brain is flexible enough to reorganize itself, to break free from pathological patterns while maintaining enough structure to integrate the new configurations. This is the therapeutic window. This is where transformation happens. And here's the key insight. The dark night of the soul is the psyche's natural attempt to reach this state of optimal entropy, to break free from rigidly maladaptive patterns by temporarily increasing psychological chaos. It's not comfortable, it's not safe, but it might be necessary. Contemporary psychologists have given us more maps for this territory. Peter Levine's work on trauma has shown us that psychological breakdown often occurs when unprocessed trauma finally demands integration. Gabor Mate has revealed how the disease we call addiction is actually an adaptive response to psychological pain, and how recovery requires facing the pain we've been running from our entire lives. Tara Brach speaks of the trance of unworthiness that must be broken. Stephen Cope writes about yoga as a practice of systematic ego dissolution. Bessel van der Kolk has shown how trauma lives in the body and how healing requires not just talking, but experiencing the somatic unraveling of frozen survival patterns. All of these modern approaches point to the same truth the ancients knew. Sometimes you must fall apart before you can come together in a new configuration. Sometimes the breakdown is not the problem. The breakdown is the breakthrough trying to happen. But perhaps most striking is the growing recognition in transpersonal psychology and consciousness studies that the line between spiritual awakening and psychotic break is far thinner than we've been taught to believe. Both involve the dissolution of ordinary reality tunnels. Both involve encounters with material that seems to come from beyond the individual ego. Both can be terrifying, overwhelming, and deeply destabilizing. The difference might not be in the experience itself, but in how we hold it, whether we have a framework to understand it, a community to support us through it, whether we can surrender to the dissolution rather than grip even tighter to the ego that's already dying. This is the territory we've been given. This is the map drawn by mystics, philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists across millennia. They all agree on the fundamental paradox. To find yourself, you must first lose yourself completely. To be reborn, you must first consent to die. The dark night of the soul is not an aberration in human development. It is the crucible. It is the alchemical vessel in which the raw material of suffering is transformed into the gold of wisdom. It is the sacred and terrible passage through which consciousness evolves. And it is waiting for each of us, whether we know it or not, hiding in the shadows of our carefully constructed lives, patient as death itself, knowing that sooner or later the walls will crack, the ground will give way, and we will fall into the darkness we've spent our entire existence avoiding. The only question is, when that moment comes, will we understand what's happening? Will we recognize the breakdown for what it truly is, not an ending, but a beginning? Not a failure, but an initiation? Let us now descend deeper still into the lived experience of this dissolution, into the phenomenology of the dark night itself. Inside the architecture of collapse, there is a moment that every person who has experienced the dark night of the soul remembers with terrible clarity. It's the moment when you realize that something fundamental has shifted, something inside you has broken in a way that cannot be fixed by the usual methods. Positive thinking, distraction, willpower, advice from well-meaning friends. It often begins quietly. Perhaps it starts with a morning where you wake up and the simple act of opening your eyes feels like lifting an enormous weight. The light that once brought the promise of a new day now feels harsh, intrusive, accusing. You lie there, and a thought drifts through your consciousness like smoke. I don't know how to do this anymore. Do what? Everything. Be a person. Maintain the performance. Hold the center. At first you tell yourself it's just a bad day. Everyone has bad days. You force yourself out of bed. You go through the motions. But there's something different now. Something off. The actions that once felt natural now feel mechanical, rehearsed, as if you're an actor who's suddenly forgotten which play they're in, which lines come next, why any of this matters. Or maybe it doesn't start quietly at all. Maybe it arrives with the force of a lightning strike, a sudden panic attack that seems to come from nowhere, an inexplicable wave of terror that makes your heart race and your vision narrow, and your mind scream that something is catastrophically wrong, though you can't name what. You find yourself in an emergency room at 3 a.m., convinced you're dying, only to be told your heart is fine, your blood work is normal, there's nothing physically wrong with you. But you know better. You know something is very, very wrong, just not in a way the tests can measure. Or perhaps it begins with the slow erosion of meaning. The career you've been building suddenly seems hollow, a strange game you've been playing without ever asking why. The relationships that once sustained you now feel like elaborate performances, mutual agreements to maintain comfortable fictions about who you are and what you want. The beliefs that once gave your life structure, religious, political, personal, start to feel like fairy tales you told yourself to ward off the darkness. And now the darkness is here anyway, and the fairy tales have lost their power. This is how it begins, with the first cracks in the architecture of self. But the dark night of the soul is not just one experience. It unfolds in stages, each more devastating than the last, each stripping away another layer of the identity you've clung to for survival. Let me take you through what it feels like, from the inside, as the dissolution deepens. Stage 1. The awakening to inauthenticity. The first stage is often triggered by what James Hollis, the Jungian analyst, calls the middle passage. That moment, often in midlife but possible at any age, when you wake up to the terrible recognition that you've been living someone else's life. You look around at the life you've built, the career, the relationship, the house, the daily routines, and you realize with slowly dawning horror that you didn't really choose any of this, not authentically. You chose it because it seemed like what you should want, because your parents wanted it for you, because society told you this was success, because you were too afraid to admit what you actually wanted, or you didn't even know what you actually wanted because you'd spent so long performing for others that you'd lost all connection to your authentic desires. This realization doesn't come gently. It comes like nausea, like suffocation. You feel trapped in a life that suddenly feels like a prison of your own making. Every morning you wake up and put on the mask, competent professional, dutiful partner, responsible parent, whatever role you've been assigned or assigned yourself, and every day the mask feels heavier, more foreign, until you can barely breathe beneath its weight. You start to feel like a fraud, an imposter. Not in the clinical sense of imposter syndrome, where you fear you're not good enough at what you do. This is deeper. You feel like a fraud at the level of being itself. Like the person everyone sees, everyone including you, is just a carefully maintained illusion, and beneath it there's nothing. Or worse, something so foreign and frightening that you've spent your entire life running from it. Depression sets in, but not the kind that responds to medication or therapy or self-care. This is existential depression, ontological depression, depression about the very nature of your existence. Viktor Frankl called it existential vacuum, the feeling that your life, despite all its external markers of success or normality, is fundamentally meaningless. You might try to fix it with external changes, a new job, a new relationship, a new city, a new hobby, anything to escape the growing sense that something is rotting at the core of your existence. But the changes don't help, because the problem isn't external. The problem is that the self you've been trying to be was never real to begin with, and now it's collapsing under the weight of its own fabrication. Stage 2. The collapse of meaning structures. As the inauthenticity becomes undeniable, the next stage begins, the collapse of the meaning structures that have organized your reality. This is when your belief systems start to crumble. The political ideology that once seemed obviously true now appears naive or destructive. The religious faith that once provided comfort and guidance now feels like a comforting lie you told yourself to avoid facing the abyss. The personal philosophy you've lived by, work hard and you'll succeed, be good and you'll be loved, trust and you won't be betrayed, reveals itself as a child's bargain with a universe that never agreed to the terms. The psychologist Robert Kegan has a beautiful and terrible way of describing this. He talks about how we don't just have beliefs, we are held by them. Our meaning-making structures aren't just ideas we happen to agree with, they're the very ground we stand on, the framework through which we interpret every experience, the invisible lens through which we see the world. And when that framework begins to collapse, it's not just that you change your mind about some things, it's that the ground itself gives way. You're in free fall, and there's nothing to grab onto because everything you could grab onto was part of the structure that's collapsing. This is when the anxiety becomes unbearable. Not worry about specific things, losing your job, paying your bills, getting sick. This is free-floating anxiety, dread without object, the feeling that something terrible is about to happen or is already happening, though you can't say what. You wake at 3 a.m. with your heart pounding, with a sense of impending doom so strong you can taste it, but there's nothing to fix, nothing to fight, nothing to run from. The threat is everywhere and nowhere. The threat is existence itself. Some people describe this stage as feeling like they're going crazy, and in a sense they are, if we define sanity as the ability to maintain a coherent narrative about self and world, to function within consensus reality, to trust that things mean what they seem to mean. That kind of sanity is disintegrating. You find yourself questioning things that once seemed self-evident. Who am I? What is real? Can I trust my own perceptions? My own memories? Do I actually know anything at all? Or have I just been repeating inherited beliefs my entire life? These aren't philosophical questions asked from comfortable distance. These are urgent, visceral demands for answers that won't come. And the more you try to think your way out, the deeper you sink into confusion. The psychiatrist R.D. Laing, who worked with people diagnosed with schizophrenia, wrote something profound. Insanity is a perfectly rational adjustment to an insane world. Sometimes what we call mental breakdown is actually the breaking open of a defensive structure that was itself insane, a false self constructed to survive in a world that punishes authenticity. The breakdown feels crazy because you're waking up to how crazy the previous normal was. Stage 3. The death of identity. If you survive the collapse of meaning structures, and not everyone does, at least not intact, you enter the third stage, the death of identity itself. This is the deepest part of the dark night, the place where John of the Cross's poetry was born, the place where Jung nearly lost himself completely. This is ego death, not the temporary ego death of a psychedelic experience that lasts hours, but a sustained dissolution that can go on for months or years. Your sense of being a separate, continuous self begins to fragment. The story you've been telling about who you are, your life narrative, your personality, your values and goals and dreams, stops making sense. You look at photos of yourself from a year ago, 5 years ago, and you don't recognize the person in the image. Not just I've changed, more like, who was that? Was that ever me? Was there ever a me to begin with? This is when the depression deepens into something that feels like death itself. You're not just sad. You're not just hopeless. You're dissolved. The boundaries that used to define you, where you end and the world begins, what you want versus what others want, what's you versus what's been conditioned into you, all of it becomes fluid, uncertain, terrifying. Some people describe it as feeling like they're disappearing, like they're becoming transparent, insubstantial, a ghost haunting their own life. You look in the mirror, and the face looking back seems alien, wrong, like a mask that doesn't fit. You hear your own voice, and it sounds strange, disconnected, as if someone else is speaking through you. The clinical term is depersonalization and derealization. The person feels unreal. The world feels unreal. There's a sense of watching your life from behind a thick pane of glass, going through the motions but not actually present, not actually there. It's one of the most disturbing experiences the human psyche can undergo because it threatens the most fundamental thing we have, our sense of existing as a coherent subject in a real world. And yet, here's the paradox that ancient wisdom understood and modern psychology is rediscovering. This dissolution, this ego death, this terrifying sense of selflessness might actually be revealing something true. Maybe you feel like you're disappearing because the you thought you were was always just a construct, a story, a habit of consciousness. Maybe the terror you're experiencing is the ego's last desperate attempt to assert that it exists, even as deeper awareness reveals that what you call self is actually a process, not a thing, a verb, not a noun, a temporary organization of awareness that has no substantial reality beyond its own functioning. This is what the Buddhist tradition has been pointing to for 2,500 years, with the doctrine of anatta, no self. Not that you don't exist at all, but that what you call you is empty of independent, permanent, singular selfhood. You're more like a river than a rock, constantly changing, composed entirely of flows and processes, only seeming solid from a distance. And the dark night is what happens when you get close enough to see through the illusion. The ego, sensing its own insubstantiality, panics, it thrashes, it fights, it creates enormous suffering in its death throes, because if there's no solid self, then what? Who is experiencing all this? Who is suffering? Who will die? Stage 4. The void. If you go deep enough, and again, this is not voluntary, this is not something you choose, but something that chooses you, you eventually reach what mystics call the void, and what existentialists call the abyss, and what psychologists might call complete psychic dissolution. This is the place beyond fear, beyond pain, beyond even despair. This is the place of absolute emptiness, where even the suffering self has dissolved, leaving only what? Nothing? Awareness without content? The groundless ground? People who've been here struggle to describe it because language itself is predicated on subject-object duality, on there being someone to describe and something to describe. But in the void, that duality collapses. There's no one left to report back. There's just witnessing, being, consciousness without content. Some people experience this as peace, the peace of total surrender, of ego death so complete that there's no one left to resist. Others experience it as the ultimate horror, annihilation, nihilism, the discovery that beneath all the stories and structures and desperate meaning-making, there's nothing but emptiness. The existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre described this as the nausea of pure existence, the recognition that things simply are without necessity, without justification, without inherent meaning. You look at the world and suddenly see it stripped of all the interpretive frameworks that usually make it comprehensible. A chair is not a chair, it's just wood and metal arranged in a particular configuration that humans decided to call chair and use for sitting. Your own hand is not your hand, it's flesh and bone and electrical signals, no more essentially yours than the chair is essentially a chair. Everything is radically contingent. Nothing had to exist. Nothing has to mean anything. The entire human world of meaning is revealed as a collective hallucination, a shared dream we've agreed to pretend is real. And now you're awake, and the dream has lost its power, and you're left in the terrifying recognition that there is no ultimate ground, no foundation, no absolute truth to rest upon, just existence, raw and unexplained, staring back at you through your own eyes. This is the existential crisis at its apex. This is what Kierkegaard meant by the sickness unto death. This is why Nietzsche declared that God is dead and warned that when we gaze into the abyss gazes also into us. But here's what neither the existentialists nor the medical establishment fully understood. You can go through the void and emerge on the other side. You can die completely and still wake up the next morning. The question is, what happens then? What emerges from that emptiness? What kind of consciousness is born from the ashes of ego death? The neuroscience of darkness. While the phenomenology of the dark night is devastating, neuroscience is beginning to map what's actually happening in the brain during these experiences. Remember the default mode network we discussed? During severe depression and existential crisis, this network shows altered patterns. But it's not just about decreased activity. Sometimes it's about rigidity, about the brain getting locked into self-referential thought patterns that loop endlessly, chewing on the same impossible questions, trapped in recursive cycles of rumination and self-analysis. Imagine your brain as a landscape with rivers. The rivers are your habitual neural pathways, the routes information usually flows along. In healthy functioning, you have many rivers, and they flow efficiently toward adaptive behaviors and flexible responses. But in depression and existential crisis, some of these rivers have dried up entirely, while others have become raging torrents that erode the landscape itself, carving deeper and deeper grooves of negative thought patterns. Neuroscientist Carl Friston's free energy principle suggests that the brain's fundamental imperative is to minimize surprise, to maintain a stable model of reality. Depression, from this view, is what happens when your internal model of the world no longer matches your experience. Your brain is desperately trying to update its predictions, to make sense of the discrepancy, but the gulf is too wide. The cognitive dissonance creates a kind of neural crisis, and the dark night is what it feels like from the inside when your brain is attempting a radical system reorganization, shutting down old pathways, potentially creating space for new ones, but stuck in the transition state where the old is dead but the new hasn't yet been born. Dr. Judson Brewer's research on the neuroscience of meditation has shown something fascinating. The same brain regions involved in self-referential thinking, the default mode network, are also associated with addiction and craving. The ego's constant self-monitoring, its endless internal narration, its grasping after pleasant experiences and pushing away unpleasant ones, creates a kind of addiction to selfhood itself. And like any addiction, the withdrawal is agonizing. When the ego's grip begins to loosen, whether through intentional practice or involuntary psychological crisis, the brain experiences something analogous to withdrawal. The familiar patterns are disrupted. The predictable neurochemical rewards are absent. What you're left with is the raw, unmediated experience of consciousness without the buffering effect of the habitual self-construct. This is why the dark night hurts so much. You're not just sad or anxious. You're in neurological withdrawal from your own identity. The shadow's emergence. But there's another dimension to the dark night that we cannot ignore, the emergence of the shadow. Carl Jung understood that the psyche naturally divides itself into conscious and unconscious, acceptable and unacceptable, light and dark. Everything that doesn't fit with your conscious self-image, all the rage, lust, selfishness, weakness, perversion, aggression, neediness that you can't admit to having, gets pushed down into the unconscious where it forms the shadow. The shadow isn't evil. It's just unintegrated. It's the parts of yourself you've exiled in order to be loved, to fit in, to maintain a socially acceptable personality. But the shadow doesn't disappear just because you refuse to acknowledge it. It grows stronger in the darkness, gaining energy, waiting for a moment of weakness to break through. And the dark night is that moment of weakness, or rather that moment of breakthrough. When your ego defenses crumble, when your carefully maintained self-image cracks, the shadow floods in. Suddenly you're feeling things you've never let yourself feel. Rage at your parents, resentment toward your partner, contempt for the life you've built, sexual desires you've repressed, violent fantasies, suicidal ideation, all the darkness you've kept at bay, your entire life suddenly has free rein. This is terrifying because you've identified so strongly with being good, nice, in control. You think, I'm not the kind of person who feels this way. But now you're discovering that you are, in fact, exactly the kind of person who feels this way. The darkness was always there. You just couldn't see it. And here's the cruel paradox. The more rigidly good and moral you've tried to be, the darker your shadow becomes. The more you've repressed, the more violent the return of the repressed. Saints and serial killers, Jung understood, are often made of the same material, intense psychic energy that in one person gets integrated and in another gets dissociated and turns pathological. The dark night, then, is not just ego death. It's also shadow integration, the forced confrontation with everything you've been running from in yourself, and you can't bypass this. You can't spiritually bypass your shadow with positive affirmations and talk of love and light. The darkness demands to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be integrated into a more complete sense of self. This is why so many people in the dark night report feeling like they're going to the dark side, like they're becoming the thing they've always feared. You're not becoming it. You're finally seeing that it was always part of you, and that your denial of it has been costing you enormous psychic energy and creating the very fragmentation that's now causing your breakdown. The social dimension, solitude in the crowd. One of the most painful aspects of the dark night is the profound isolation it creates. You look around at other people going about their lives, functioning normally, seeming happy or at least stable, and you feel utterly alone, like you've fallen out of the shared human reality into some private hell that no one else can see or understand. You try to explain it to friends, family, therapists. I'm in pain, you say. I'm dissolving. I don't know who I am anymore. Nothing feels real. I can't find meaning in anything. And they, meaning well, try to help. They tell you to exercise, to practice gratitude, to change your perspective, to consider antidepressants, to remember all the good things in your life. And every piece of advice, though well-intentioned, feels like a knife because it reveals how completely they don't understand. This isn't about having the wrong perspective. This is about the total collapse of the mechanism that generates perspective in the first place. You smile, you nod. You say you'll try their suggestions, and then you go home, and the isolation deepens, because now you can't even share what you're going through without seeming ungrateful or difficult or crazy. This is the dark night's special cruelty. It happens inside you, invisible to others, unshareable even when you find words for it. It's a fundamentally solitary experience, even when you're surrounded by people. Maybe especially when you're surrounded by people, because their continued functioning in consensus reality only highlights how far you've fallen from it. And society has no ritual container for this experience anymore. The indigenous cultures had initiation rites, the mystery schools had guided journeys, the monasteries had contemplative practices held within supportive communities. But we've lost all that. We've pathologized transformation and medicalized the soul. So when you enter the dark night, you do so alone, often convinced you're broken rather than breaking open, ill rather than initiating, failing rather than transforming. The question of suicide. We must speak plainly about the darkest moment of the dark night, when death seems like the only escape. The suicidal ideation that accompanies severe psychological and spiritual crisis is not always about wanting to die. Often it's about wanting to kill the self that's suffering, wanting to destroy the prison of identity that's become unbearable. But the tragic error is thinking that destroying the body will destroy the suffering, when what actually needs to die is the ego, the false self, the constructed identity. This is why ancient initiation rites involved symbolic death. They understood that the psyche needs death without actual physical death, transformation without literal destruction. The old self had to die so the new self could be born, but without a ritual container, without wise guides, without a framework to understand what's happening, people sometimes literalize the metaphorical death. If you're in this place now, if you're listening to these words from the edge of that abyss, hear this. What wants to die is not you. What wants to die is the story of you, the constructed self, the identity that's become too small, too rigid, too painful to maintain. You can let that die without dying yourself. The ego doesn't believe this. The ego thinks it is you, so its death feels like your death. But you are not your ego. You are the awareness that's been watching the ego dissolve. You are the consciousness that's been witnessing this entire breakdown. That awareness cannot die because it was never born. It has no substance to destroy, it simply is. This is the most important truth you'll ever hear. You can survive the complete death of everything you thought you were, and what remains will be more real, more alive, more authentically you than anything you've experienced before. But you must endure the passage. You must walk through the valley of the shadow without knowing whether you'll emerge on the other side. This is the leap of faith, not faith in God or meaning or future happiness, but faith in the process itself, faith that dissolution is part of transformation, faith that the death is also a birth. And now, having descended as deep as we can go into the phenomenology of breakdown, having mapped the stages of dissolution and explored the neuroscience and psychology and existential dimensions of this crisis, we must ask the essential question: what happens next? What emerges from the void? What is reborn from the death of the ego? Is there really something on the other side of this darkness? Or is that just another story we tell ourselves to make the suffering bearable? Let us find out. Rebirth beyond the ruins. There is a moment in the deepest darkness when something shifts. You can't predict it. You can't force it. You can't even prepare for it because it comes from a place beyond the ego's control, beyond the will, beyond everything you've learned about how transformation is supposed to work. It often arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first grey light of dawn after the longest night, so faint you're not even sure it's real or just another cruel trick of perception. Maybe you're lying in bed, having endured another sleepless night of existential terror, and suddenly you notice you're noticing. There's an awareness watching the suffering, separate from it. Not the ego watching, that's still in pieces on the floor, but something deeper, quieter, something that's been there all along, patiently witnessing the entire dissolution. Or maybe you're walking, moving through the world on autopilot like you have been for months, and suddenly, for just a second, the veil lifts. You see a tree, really see it, stripped of all the conceptual overlays and labels and meanings, and it's just there, existing in its own right, and somehow that simple fact, that things exist, that existence is, strikes you with a force that brings tears. Or maybe the shift comes through surrender so complete it can't even be called surrender anymore, because there's no one left to surrender. The ego has fought so long, has tried so hard to maintain control, to make sense of the senseless, to fix what's broken, to become who you're supposed to be. And finally, exhausted beyond measure, it just stops. Not because you decided to stop, but because there's simply no energy left to continue the struggle. And in that stopping, that absolute cessation of the fight, something remarkable happens. The suffering doesn't necessarily end. The confusion doesn't magically resolve. The existential questions don't get answered. But your relationship to all of it shifts. You're no longer at war with your own experience. You're no longer resisting the dissolution. You're no longer trying to get back to who you were before this started, because you're finally beginning to understand you can't go back. That person is gone, and trying to resurrect them is what's been causing most of the pain. This is the first glimmer of awakening, not an awakening to some transcendent truth or cosmic consciousness, not yet anyway, but an awakening to acceptance, an awakening to letting be, an awakening to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, you don't need to be put back together in the old configuration. The space between stories. The psychiatrist and writer Mark Epstein calls this period the space between stories, that liminal zone where the old narrative has died, but the new one hasn't yet crystallized. You're not who you were, but you're not yet who you'll become. You're in transition, in metamorphosis, in the cocoon stage where you're neither caterpillar nor butterfly, but some liquefied something in between. This space is uncomfortable. The ego wants a story. It wants to know, who am I now? What does this mean? Where do I go from here? It wants to construct a new identity immediately, to fill the void with something, anything, to avoid the vertigo of narrative emptiness. But here's what the mystics and the depth psychologists understood that the ego cannot. This space between stories is sacred. This is where real transformation happens. This is the fertile void from which something genuinely new can emerge. In Taoism, they speak of wu wei, effortless action, non-doing. Not passivity, but action that flows from deep spontaneity rather than ego striving. You can only access wu wei in this space between stories when you're not trying to force yourself into a predetermined shape, when you're allowing what wants to emerge organically. The poet Rilke wrote in his letters to a young poet, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Do not now seek the answers which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then, gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. This is the wisdom required for the space between stories. Don't rush to construct a new self. Don't grasp for new meanings, new beliefs, new identities to fill the emptiness. Instead, learn to live in the questions. Learn to tolerate the uncertainty. Learn to exist without the security of a fixed story about who you are. This is extraordinarily difficult for most of us because we've been conditioned to believe that having a clear identity is essential for psychological health. We're told, know yourself, define your values, set your goals, be clear about who you are and what you want. But what if that entire framework is itself a form of imprisonment? What if the rigid self-concept is precisely what's been causing the suffering? What if you could exist fluidly, responsively, authentic to each moment, rather than to some abstract story about yourself? This is what the Buddhist concept of no self really points to. Not that you disappear entirely, but that you stop reifying yourself into a thing. You remain as a process, a flow, an ever-changing response to ever-changing conditions. The suffering came from trying to freeze the flow, to make permanent what was always meant to be fluid. Integration of the shadow. As you stabilize in the space between stories, something else begins to happen. The shadow material that flooded in during the crisis starts to integrate. Remember, the shadow isn't evil, it's just unintegrated. It's the rejected aspects of yourself that have been living in exile. And now, with the ego's defenses down, with the old identity shattered, there's an opportunity for these exiled parts to return home. This doesn't mean acting out every dark impulse. Integration isn't about becoming your shadow. It's about acknowledging it, giving it a voice, understanding that these parts exist for reasons that made sense in your developmental history. The rage might have been protecting you from being taken advantage of. The neediness might have been signaling that your needs weren't being met. The shadow aspects are often primitive strategies for survival and connection that got repressed because they weren't socially acceptable. Jung spoke of making the shadow conscious, not to become identified with it, but to include it in a larger awareness. When you deny your shadow, it controls you from the unconscious. When you integrate it, you gain access to its energy while remaining in choice about how to express it. Post-crisis, many people report feeling more whole precisely because they're no longer dividing themselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts. They can acknowledge anger without being consumed by it. They can feel grief without resisting it. They can recognize selfish desires without acting on them destructively. The darkness becomes just another color in the full spectrum of human experience, rather than something that must be hidden and denied. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming more whole by integrating what was split off. You don't become more perfect, you become more complete. And paradoxically, that completeness includes your imperfection, your flaws, your darkness. You stop trying to be only light and accept that you're a full human being with the full range of human capacities, creative and destructive, loving and hateful, noble and petty. And strangely, this acceptance brings relief. The exhausting labor of maintaining an idealized self-image ends. You can finally relax into being complicated, contradictory, imperfect. You can finally be real. The birth of authentic presence. What emerges from the dark night, if you've moved through it without fleeing back into the old patterns, is something that spiritual traditions have called by many names: authentic presence, true self, Buddha nature, the self, capital S, original face, essence, being. But let's try to describe it in concrete, experiential terms rather than mystical language. You start to notice that you're less reactive. Where before you would immediately jump to defend yourself, explain yourself, justify yourself, now there's a gap, a space between stimulus and response where you can choose. This isn't about self-control or willpower. It's something subtler. You're less identified with your thoughts and emotions, so they don't hijack you as completely. They arise, you notice them, and there's this witnessing presence that can choose how to respond rather than being compelled to react. You find yourself more honest, not in a harsh or brutal way, but in a way that's simple and direct. You can say, "I don't know," without shame. You can say, "I don't want to," without elaborate justifications. You can say, "I made a mistake," without your entire identity crumbling. The truth becomes easier than the performance of who you think you should be. You notice that anxiety, while it might still arise, doesn't have the same grip. Because anxiety is largely about a self that needs protecting, and that solid self has dissolved. There's still this organism that prefers pleasure to pain, connection to isolation, life to death. But the existential terror that comes from feeling like a separate, vulnerable ego trying to survive in a hostile universe, that specific flavor of dread, begins to ease. You discover a kind of effortless authenticity. You're not trying to be authentic. You've just stopped trying to be inauthentic. You're not performing enlightenment or spiritual awakening. You're just more real, more present, more yourself, whoever that is in any given moment, which changes because you're alive, because life is change, because fluidity is health. And here's perhaps the most striking shift. You develop a capacity for what the Buddhists call equanimity, the ability to remain stable and present in the face of changing conditions, both pleasant and unpleasant. Not indifference or detachment in the sense of not caring, but a deep okayness with what is, even when what is includes pain, uncertainty, or difficulty. This doesn't mean you become passive. You still take action to change what can be changed. But there's an underlying peace that isn't dependent on conditions being a certain way. You can prefer that things turn out well, while simultaneously being fundamentally okay, even if they don't. This sounds paradoxical, and it is, but it's a paradox you now live, rather than merely understand conceptually. You've been through the worst thing you could imagine, the complete dissolution of self, and you survived. More than survived. You discovered something essential that can't be destroyed because it was never constructed in the first place. The reorganization, a new complexity. From a systems theory perspective, what's happened during and after the Dark Night is a process of death and reorganization at a higher level of complexity. Your psyche was organized around certain principles, certain narratives, certain core beliefs and identity structures. These structures served you for a time, but they were too rigid, too simple for the complexity of reality you were actually experiencing. The crisis was the system breaking down because it could no longer maintain its current level of organization. The developmental psychologist Robert Kegan describes this as a shift from one order of consciousness to another, from a simpler way of making meaning to a more complex one that can hold more contradictions, more perspectives, more ambiguity. But you can't just think your way into a higher order of consciousness. The shift requires actual transformation, which usually involves crisis, breakdown, and reorganization. In chaos theory, they call this phenomenon phase transition, like water turning to ice or steam. The substance is the same, but its organization changes dramatically, and right at the moment of transition, there's maximum chaos, maximum instability. The system is neither solid nor liquid, neither the old form nor the new. It's in flux. This is the dark night, the phase transition of consciousness itself. What emerges on the other side is a psyche reorganized around new principles. Instead of rigid beliefs, there's flexible inquiry. Instead of a solid identity, there's fluid responsiveness. Instead of needing to know, there's comfort with mystery. Instead of defending a position, there's genuine dialogue. Instead of seeking to become someone, there's an allowance of what already is. This is what Zen calls beginner's mind, the capacity to meet each moment fresh, without the weight of past conditioning completely determining your response. You're still shaped by your history, but you're not enslaved by it. You can see your patterns, your habits, your conditioned responses, and in seeing them, you're no longer completely identified with them. The philosophical shift. From meaning-seeking to meaning-making. One of the most profound shifts that occurs post-crisis is in your relationship to meaning itself. Before the dark night, you were likely seeking meaning, looking for it in religion, relationships, career, ideology, trying to find some ultimate answer to the question, what does it all mean? Why are we here? What's the point? And the dark night revealed the terrible truth. There is no inherent meaning. The universe doesn't come with a user manual. Existence doesn't have a purpose that's written in the stars waiting to be discovered. All meaning is constructed, created by conscious beings projecting significance onto a fundamentally neutral reality. This realization is initially devastating. It's the heart of nihilism, the source of existential despair. If there's no ultimate meaning, why do anything? Why not just end it all? But here's where the post-crisis wisdom enters. The fact that meaning is constructed doesn't make it any less real or valuable. In fact, it makes it more powerful, because you're no longer waiting for someone else, God, society, fate, to tell you what your life should mean. You're free to create meaning yourself. The existentialists understood this beautifully. Sartre declared that existence precedes essence. You exist first, and then you create your essence through your choices and actions. You're condemned to be free, which sounds bleak but is actually liberating once you accept it. Camus, in the myth of Sisyphus, imagined Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill forever, only to watch it roll back down each time, as a figure of tragic triumph. Why? Because Sisyphus can still choose his relationship to his fate. He can rebel against the meaninglessness by deciding that the struggle itself is enough. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, Camus wrote, not because his task has ultimate purpose, but because he's free to create his own meaning within the absurd. After the dark night, you might find yourself in a similar position. You're no longer looking for the meaning, the one true purpose that will make everything make sense. Instead, you're making meaning moment by moment, choice by choice, creating significance through engagement with life itself. You might discover meaning in relationships, not because humans are inherently meaningful, but because you choose to care, to connect, to love. You might discover meaning in creativity, not because art has cosmic significance, but because the act of creating is intrinsically fulfilling. You might discover meaning in alleviating suffering, not because suffering has a higher purpose, but because when you see pain and you can ease it, that feels right in a way that doesn't need metaphysical justification. This is what Viktor Frankl meant when he said that meaning isn't something we invent or discover. It's something we create through how we respond to our circumstances. Even in a concentration camp, even in the worst conditions imaginable, humans can find or create meaning through their response to suffering. The transpersonal dimension, beyond the personal self. For many people, the dark night opens doorways to what transpersonal psychology calls experiences beyond the personal self, moments where the sense of separate identity expands or dissolves temporarily, revealing a larger context of consciousness. These experiences are difficult to describe because language is designed for the dualistic world of subject and object, self and other. But people report experiences of unity consciousness, brief moments where the sense of separation between self and world dissolves completely. You're not looking at the tree, you're the tree looking at itself. You're not a separate observer of reality. You're a focal point through which reality observes itself. Encounters with archetypal forces, powerful symbolic presences that seem to come from deeper layers of the psyche, or perhaps from what Jung called the collective unconscious. Gods, demons, spirits, ancestors, whether you interpret these literally or metaphorically, they carry a numinous quality, a sense of touching something vast and ancient. Mystical experiences of the type William James catalogued in the Varieties of Religious Experience, states of consciousness characterized by ineffability, can't fully be described in words, noetic quality, feeling of profound insight or revelation, transiency, brief duration, and passivity, happening to you rather than being generated by your will. Past life memories or expanded identity experiences where the boundaries of who and what you are seem to extend beyond your current biographical self, though these can also be understood as the psyche accessing deeper layers of symbolic material or collective human experience. Now here's the crucial point. Whether these experiences point to some metaphysical reality, souls, reincarnation, cosmic consciousness, God, or whether they're sophisticated artifacts of brain functioning under non-ordinary conditions, they're profoundly transformative either way. They shatter the cramped materialism that says, you're nothing but a body, nothing but your biography, nothing but neurons firing in patterns that create the illusion of consciousness. Even if you remain agnostic about their ultimate nature, these experiences expand your sense of what's possible, what consciousness can do, what you might be beyond the small self that was suffering so acutely. And crucially, they provide context for the dark night itself. You realize, oh, this isn't just my crisis. This is human crisis. This is the soul's journey. This is what consciousness does as it evolves. The suffering becomes less personal, less about your individual failings, more about participating in something larger, the great work of consciousness becoming aware of itself. The integration challenge, living between worlds. Here's the difficulty nobody tells you about. After you've been through the death and rebirth, after you've touched the void and emerged transformed, you still have to live in ordinary reality. You still have bills to pay, relationships to navigate, a body that needs food and sleep, a mind that still generates neurotic thoughts. You've seen behind the curtain. You've experienced the constructed nature of the self. You've touched states of consciousness that revealed the relative nature of all your usual concerns. And now you have to care about whether you remembered to buy milk. This is what spiritual teachers often fail to prepare people for, the integration challenge, the mystical experience, the ego death, the profound realization. These are actually the easy part. The hard part is integrating the insight into your actual human life without spiritual bypassing, using spiritual ideas to avoid dealing with psychological issues, or becoming what they call a spiritual materialist, collecting experiences and insights like trophies. The Zen tradition has a beautiful metaphor for this. They say that before enlightenment, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. During the experience of awakening, mountains are no longer mountains and rivers are no longer rivers. all solid categories dissolve into the flux of bare experience. But after enlightenment, mountains are again mountains and rivers are rivers, but you're forever changed by having seen through them. You return to ordinary life, but you're not quite the same person. You can participate in the conventional world, going to work, having relationships, dealing with mundane tasks, while simultaneously holding a larger awareness that none of it is quite as solid or serious as it appears. You can be in the game without being fooled by it. This requires developing what Robert Kierkegaard calls the self-transforming mind, a level of development where you can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, including the perspective on your own perspective. You can observe yourself having beliefs without being completely identified with those beliefs. You can participate in creating meaning while recognizing that meaning as constructed. You can act with commitment while holding your commitments lightly. This sounds paradoxical, and living it requires developing a kind of psychological agility that most people never need because they remain firmly embedded in a single perspective. But once you've been through the dark night, once you've seen the relative nature of all perspectives, you can't unsee it. You're forever displaced from naive certainty, forever exiled from the comfortable consensus reality where things are simply what they seem. The integration challenge is finding a way to live with wisdom and compassion in a world that mostly operates from much simpler levels of awareness, without becoming arrogant about your experience, without rejecting the world because it seems unaware, without using your insights as a bypass for genuine engagement with the messy reality of being human. The gift, compassion, born from brokenness. Perhaps the most beautiful thing that emerges from the dark night, if you've moved through it with some degree of consciousness, is a profound compassion, both for yourself and for others. You've been to the bottom. You've experienced the terror of complete dissolution. You've felt the weight of existential despair. You've touched the shadow. You've walked through the valley of death. And because you've been there, you now have a visceral understanding of human suffering that can't be matched by any amount of theoretical knowledge. When you meet someone else who's struggling with depression, addiction, existential crisis, trauma, whatever form their suffering takes, you don't see them as weak or broken. You see them as courageous souls facing their own dark night. You recognize the signs because you've walked that path, and instead of judgment or pity, you feel kinship, solidarity, the deep knowing that says, I see you, I've been there, you're not alone. This is what Leonard Cohen meant when he sang, there is a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. The brokenness isn't something to be ashamed of or fixed or transcended. The brokenness is what makes us permeable to light, to grace, to compassion, to truth. Our wounds become our wisdom. Our suffering becomes our service. You might find yourself drawn to helping others in ways you couldn't have before the crisis. Not from a savior complex or ego-driven need to be important, but from a genuine wish to ease suffering because you know how much it hurts. You might become a therapist, a teacher, a writer, an artist who uses their work to illuminate the path through darkness. Or you might simply become more present, more available, more real in your everyday relationships, which is its own form of profound service. The dark night gives you something precious, your brokenness as gift. The places where you shattered become the places where you're most open, most honest, most able to meet others without the armor of false strength. You stop pretending to have it all together because you know what a fragile illusion that is. And in your willingness to be vulnerable, to admit that you don't have all the answers, you create space for others to be vulnerable too. This is true strength, not the rigidity that never cracks, but the flexibility that can break and reform, learning from each fracture, becoming more resilient not despite the breaking, but because of it. The evolution of consciousness, your part in the larger story. Zoom out now. Step back from your personal story and see it in the context of the entire human journey. the evolution of consciousness itself, from the first spark of awareness in primitive life forms to the complex self-reflective consciousness reading these words right now. Every crisis of identity, every breakdown and breakthrough, every dark night of the soul is not just a personal event. It's consciousness evolving. It's the universe becoming more aware of itself through your individual experience. Your suffering is not meaningless. Your transformation is not just for you. The cultural historian Jean Gebser mapped the evolution of consciousness through several structures: archaic, magical, mythical, mental, and integral. Each transition required a death of the old structure and birth of the new. And each transition created crisis for the individuals and cultures going through it. We're living through one of those transitions now. The mental structure, the rational, analytical, separate self-consciousness that has dominated Western culture for centuries, is reaching its limits. Its gifts are undeniable: science, technology, individual rights, critical thinking. But its shadow is also clear: alienation, environmental destruction, meaning crisis, epidemic levels of anxiety and depression. The next structure, integral consciousness, requires developing the capacity to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to think both analytically and intuitively, to honor both science and mysticism, to be both individual and connected to the whole. It requires, in other words, the death of the exclusive identification with the rational ego mind. And guess what facilitates that death? The dark night of the soul. Your personal crisis might be part of a collective initiation. Your breakdown might be evolution itself, working through you to create new forms of consciousness. You're not just healing yourself, you're pioneering new territory for the species. This doesn't make it easier, but it might make it meaningful in a way that purely personal narratives can't capture. You're not just trying to feel better, you're participating in the most important project consciousness has ever undertaken: its own evolution. The mystics have always known this. They've always understood that individual awakening ripples out, affecting the larger field of consciousness. The Bodhisattva vow in Buddhism captures this: to postpone one's own final liberation until all beings can be liberated, not because any individual can save everyone, but because consciousness is not as separate as it appears. Your liberation contributes to the collective liberation. Your healing creates space for others' healing. So when you emerge from your dark night transformed, you carry that transformation back into the world, not as a teacher necessarily, not as someone special, but as a living reminder that consciousness can evolve, that the death is also birth, that the darkness contains its own light. The technology of transformation, new tools for ancient journeys. One final dimension to explore. We're living in a unique moment in history where ancient wisdom about consciousness transformation is meeting cutting-edge neuroscience and technology. Psychedelic research has returned after decades of prohibition, and what scientists are finding is remarkable. These medicines can facilitate in hours the kind of ego dissolution and mystical experience that might take years of meditation practice or might occur spontaneously in a severe psychological crisis. The early research on psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, MDMA for PTSD, ayahuasca for addiction, all showing remarkable results precisely because these medicines temporarily disrupt the default mode network, allowing the rigid patterns of the depressed or traumatized brain to reorganize at a higher level of flexibility. This is not about escaping reality or getting high. This is about using pharmacological tools to facilitate the death-rebirth process in a controlled setting with proper support. It's making the dark night accessible, guiding people through ego death and back again, providing the transformative experience that might otherwise take a devastating spontaneous crisis to achieve. But here's the crucial insight. The medicine doesn't do the transformation. You do. The psychedelic, like the spontaneous dark night, simply creates the conditions where your psyche can reorganize itself. The real work is the integration, taking the insights and experiences back into your ordinary life, allowing them to change how you live, how you relate, how you create meaning. Similarly, Advanced meditation techniques, trauma therapy modalities like EMDR and somatic experiencing, breathwork practices, and even neurofeedback. All of these are tools that can facilitate the death-rebirth process without necessarily requiring a years-long psychological crisis. This is both promising and dangerous. Promising because suffering might be shortened, because transformation might become more accessible. Dangerous because you can't shortcut genuine transformation. You can't skip the death and just get to the rebirth. The descent must be made, the shadow must be faced, the ego must genuinely surrender. Whether that happens over years or hours, whether it's spontaneous or facilitated, the actual psychological process must occur. So these tools aren't bypasses, they're accelerants. They're ways of concentrating the transformative process, but they don't eliminate the need for it. You still must be willing to die to who you were. You still must surrender control. You still must face the void. And perhaps most importantly, your transformation isn't complete until it's embodied, integrated, lived. The experience of ego death, however profound, is just the beginning. The real measure of transformation is whether you show up differently in your life, more present, more authentic, more compassionate, more whole. This is why the traditions always emphasized practice, community, and ongoing refinement. Awakening isn't an endpoint, it's a beginning. It's the start of learning how to live from your true nature rather than from your conditioned patterns, and that learning continues for the rest of your life. So here we are, at the other side of the journey. Having descended into the darkest night, having died 1,000 deaths, having surrendered everything we thought we knew about ourselves, we emerge, bruised perhaps, humbled certainly, but somehow more real, more alive, more fundamentally okay than we've ever been. The dark night of the soul is not about becoming someone new. It's about discovering who you always were beneath all the layers of conditioning, trauma, and social programming. It's about dying to the false self so the true self can breathe. And that true self isn't perfect or enlightened or beyond all human struggle. It's just more honest, more present, more willing to be fully human, with all the messiness, complexity, and beauty that entails. We began this journey with a question. What if the thing you call you was never real to begin with? Now, having walked through the valley of shadow, having touched the void and returned, perhaps you have your answer. Not an intellectual answer, something deeper, something known through direct experience of dissolution and reconstitution. The you that you thought you were, that carefully constructed identity, that collection of beliefs and roles and self-concepts, was indeed never fully real. It was real enough to serve its purpose, real enough to navigate the social world, real enough to provide temporary coherence and stability. But it was ultimately a construct, a useful fiction, a story consciousness told itself to organize experience. And the dark night revealed this, not gently. Truth rarely comes gently when it shatters worlds, but necessarily. Because something in you was ready for this knowing, even if the ego fought it tooth and nail. Something in you needed to break free from the prison of fixed identity, even if the breaking felt like dying. Now you carry this knowledge forward, not as a burden, though sometimes it might feel that way, living in a world that mostly operates from simple certainty, but as a strange gift. You know that suffering is not the enemy. Suffering is the teacher, the initiator, the fierce grace that breaks us open to larger truths. This doesn't mean you seek suffering or romanticize it. It means you no longer resist it with quite the same desperate terror, because you've learned that what seems like destruction often contains transformation. You know that control was always an illusion. The ego's project, to maintain a stable self, to predict and manage experience, to hold reality in patterns of your choosing, was doomed from the start because reality is flux, change, impermanence. And there's a strange relief in this knowing. You can finally relax your grip on the steering wheel and allow yourself to be carried by the deeper currents of existence. You know that meaning is created, not discovered. This is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because there's no ultimate reference point, no cosmic authority to tell you what your life should mean. Liberating because you're free to create meaning through your choices, your relationships, your engagement with the world. You don't need permission from the universe to care about what you care about, to love what you love, to work toward what matters to you. You know that consciousness is far stranger and more vast than you were taught. Whether through direct mystical experience or through the simple recognition that your solid self could dissolve so completely, you've touched something that doesn't fit in the materialist paradigm. You may not know what to make of this, whether it's brain chemistry or something more, but you know that consensus reality is just one possible way of organizing experience, and that the boundaries we take for granted are more permeable than we typically recognize. And perhaps most importantly, you know that you are not alone in your darkness. Every human who has ever lived or will ever live must eventually face their own version of the dark night. The specifics differ. Your crisis is unique to your psychology, your history, your circumstances. But the essential structure, the ego death, the loss of meaning, the descent into chaos before reorganization, this is universal. This means when you encounter others in their suffering, you can meet them not from above, not as the enlightened one helping the unenlightened, but as a fellow traveler who's been through some terrain and is willing to walk alongside. Your authority comes not from having transcended suffering, but from having endured it and learned from it. So what do you do now, carrying all this forward? You live. Simply, plainly, you live. You show up for your life, not the life you thought you should be living, not the ideal life some part of you is still grasping for, but the actual life you have, with its mundane joys and persistent challenges and ordinary beauties. You practice presence, not as a spiritual attainment, but as a continuous returning to here now, this breath, this moment, this reality, rather than the stories about reality that your mind constantly generates. You cultivate compassion, for yourself first, because you've been through hell and back, and you deserve the same gentleness you would offer a dear friend. For others, because everyone is fighting battles you can't see, carrying burdens you can't imagine, doing their best with the level of consciousness they currently have access to. You create meaning through engagement. You don't wait for life to reveal its purpose before you commit to something. You commit, you create, you connect, you care, and meaning emerges from that engagement rather than preceding it. You stay curious. The dark night taught you that what you think you know is limited, contingent, always subject to revision. So you remain open to new learning, new perspectives, new possibilities. You hold your beliefs lightly, knowing they're tools for navigation rather than ultimate truths. And you remember, transformation is not something that happens once. It's ongoing. You will continue to face smaller deaths, smaller dark nights for the rest of your life. Each time you outgrow an identity, each time you release an attachment, each time you face change that threatens your sense of self, you'll meet that same dissolution energy again. But now you know what it is. Now you recognize the pattern. Now you understand that the darkness is not the end of your story, but the continuation of your evolution. The dark night of the soul is not a destination. It's a passage, a doorway, a threshold you cross from one way of being to another. And on the other side, you find not the person you thought you would become, not the enlightened being or the healed self or the actualized individual, but simply yourself, more naked, more real, more willing to be exactly what you are in each moment. And that, ultimately, is the gift of darkness. It strips away everything that isn't real until only truth remains. Not truth in the sense of facts or beliefs, but truth in the sense of direct, unmediated presence, being, awareness, the simple, impossible miracle of existence itself. You are not what you thought you were. You are not broken. You are not lost. You are consciousness experiencing itself, learning about itself, evolving through itself. You are the universe waking up, looking at itself through these temporary eyes, this temporary form, this temporary story called a life. And the dark night? That terrible crisis you survived or are currently surviving, or will someday face? That was consciousness reaching a critical point where the old organization could no longer hold, where something had to shatter so something new could emerge. That was evolution working through you, painful, brutal, but ultimately in service of becoming more than you were, more than you could have imagined from the old perspective. So as we close this journey together, I'll leave you with one final thought. If you're in the darkness now, know this: it won't last forever. It feels eternal in the midst of it, but the night always gives way to dawn. The death always precedes the birth. The darkness is not where you'll remain. It's where you're passing through. And if you've emerged from the darkness, know this: your journey isn't over. Life will continue to ask you to die in small ways, to surrender what's no longer needed, to allow transformation even when it's uncomfortable. But each time, you'll be a little better at it, a little more willing, a little more trusting of the process. And if you haven't yet faced your dark night, know this: it's coming. Not as punishment, not as failure, but as invitation. When it arrives, remember what you've learned here. Remember that the breakdown is not the end. Remember that millions before you have walked this path and emerged transformed. Remember that you are stronger than you know, more resilient than you believe, more real than any story you've been telling about yourself. The dark night of the soul is not a bug in the system of human consciousness. It's a feature. It's how we evolve. It's how consciousness transcends its current limits and reaches toward new possibilities. It's painful, yes, devastating certainly, but also sacred, also necessary, also in a way that can only be understood after the fact, merciful, because what you lose in the dark night is only what was never real to begin with, what was false, constructed, defensive, small, and what you find, what was there all along, waiting beneath the rubble of the false self, is something that can never be lost because it was never made, never constructed, never separate from the groundless ground of being itself. You are that. Consciousness, awareness, being, the witness and the witnessed, the darkness and the light, the death and the birth, all of it. And somewhere, deep in the center of your being, in a place words can't quite reach, you've always known this. The dark night just removed all the distractions, burned away all the false certainties, stripped away all the comfortable illusions until only this knowing remained. Welcome home. Welcome to the other side of darkness. Welcome to the life that begins when you stop living someone else's story and start living your own truth. Welcome to the consciousness that emerges when the constructed self finally, gratefully, releases its exhausting grip and lets what's real breathe. The journey continues. It always continues. But now you walk it with different eyes, different understanding, different relationship to both the darkness and the light, and that makes all the difference. Thank you for walking this path with me. If this journey touched something true in you, whether you're in the midst of your dark night or looking back on one you've survived, know that you are not alone. We are all in this together, all learning to be human, all fumbling toward truth, all carrying the precious burden of consciousness awakening to itself. May you find light in the darkness. May you find truth in the dissolution. May you find yourself, your true self, in the ruins of who you thought you had to be. Until we meet again in the mysterious depths of consciousness itself, this is Echoes of the Ancients, reminding you that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not from learning new things, but from unlearning everything you thought you knew. Stay curious, stay present, stay human.